So we're back. This is part 2 of 8, and it's based on a document called Introduction to General Federalism. And part 2 is, we're actually still in the same section we were in part 1. Part 1 was the section on why we might want global rule of law. And the video series is entitled World Government and General Federalism. And this, as I said, the first section we got, what we went through was why we might want global rule of law, and we didn't quite finish that. So we're going to finish that section. There's just a little bit more left to do. And then we're going to begin the next section, which we'll get about halfway through. And that is why new ideas are needed. So I'll go ahead and start where we left off. We were in, let's see, we had just finished up one of the reasons. We're going through that list of reasons why we might want global rule of law, and we were about to go to another reason in that list. So I'll just go ahead and start reading and try to provide commentary as I go. So here we go. If war is not desirable, anything that mitigates it is a good thing if the cost to do so is not greater. While war is probably inevitable, any system that tends to prevent it and bring conflict into a court setting will likely be an improvement. The vast majority of conflicts result in a much larger death toll for civilians than military personnel. Any degree to which rule of law can draw people off the battlefield would be an exponential improvement. Having a condition in which the world is governed by nearly 200 separate, fully sovereign regimes is insane, and is the very essence of international anarchy. This condition, viewed at the level of interstate relations, is by definition anarchy. This cannot be good for humanity. 200 years ago, anarchy at this level didn't matter, since the technological infrastructure was too limited for the problems of anarchy in this arena to be realized. This is no longer the case, and constant struggles between nations over the selfish pursuit of resources will only get more intense. The various forms of genocide and ethnic cleansing would be far less likely, arguably impossible, under global rule of law. And likewise, if poverty is not desirable, anything that mitigates it is a good thing if the cost to do so is not greater. And this is related to the economics topic, but basically a system of justice and economics is needed. Poverty is also inevitable, but anything that mitigates it by instituting principles of justice and economics is worth the effort. Some people will, they'll say, well, poverty is, a subjective and relative definition, and that, there'll always be poverty because there'll always be a relative, difference. But there is a difference, though, between, a good way to define poverty probably as an operational definition would be, does one have enough resources to provide their basic needs? And if they don't, then that would be poverty. And there are millions of people, possibly billions, that live like that. So that's how we would look at poverty. Another reason, and it says last but not least, but I don't know if that's not quite right. There's one more after that. But anyway, the initial reason why general federalism itself became linked to global rule of law by definition is peculiar. When the original founder first began this exercise back in the early 80s, the goal was to try to solve the more basic question of the, quote, ideal republic, something sought after for hundreds of years. The founder was doing this because the founder wanted to be sure the ideas were placed on a solid footing. The earliest conclusion reached was that the social sciences involve indeterminacy. That is, the social sciences deal with uncertainty. Unlike physics, in which the founder was an expert, one couldn't derive certain definitive laws in the social sciences in the same way one can in physics, even if we assume that the certainty of physical laws isn't, epistemologically speaking, strictly certain. The point is that, relative to physics, social sciences at least were less certain than physics. Therefore, in an attempt to at least frame the conversation, the founder wanted to at least identify those things that the founder could be certain of, if possible. What was found was that any ideal republic would require that no external sovereign powers, which still have the capacity for contact with the presumptive ideal republic, could coexist with it. And this is because the application of justice would require reacting to events external to the ideal republic, for which the ideal republic would have no control. And that, under such circumstances, an ideal republic, all of whose acts are just, cannot guarantee a just response in all such cases of external contact. Causality alone dictates that an external cause that we assume as a precondition, and which can have a causal effect within the ideal republic, could thence render the ideal republic something less than ideal. This derives of a thought experiment in which one places the ideal republic in a black box and runs scenarios. While an interesting artifact, it is a reason for global governance intrinsic to the ideas of general federalism, and not necessarily a universal argument for why global rule of law might be needed. But for completeness, we noted it here. So. And then finally, for this section, the final reason why we might want global rule of law. No matter how well one society organizes and manages its own consumption of energy and natural resources, if the same cannot be done in all jurisdictions, then that society's sustainability is undermined. Energy and natural resource consumption are increasing beyond our technological capacity to expand exploitation at exponential rates, and this problem is likely terminal. So what this is saying is that human beings really, as a consequence of developments in the technological infrastructure, technological innovation, tend to consume more and more energy and natural resources per capita. The more sophisticated that technological infrastructure becomes. It's part and parcel of what it is to be a technological society. So that poses a problem, because if the rate at which that's increasing outstrips or is faster than the rate at which you can find more natural resources, new sources of natural resources, and provide new technologies for more energy intense sources, then you have a terminal condition, because eventually the society will end up hitting a brick wall where it has nothing else to consume. It runs out of natural resources and energy, and it halts development. When you develop a technological infrastructure that's then dependent on all of that energy and all of those natural resources, hitting a wall like that could be catastrophic, because the entire society could collapse if it doesn't have that energy and those natural resources that it requires, per capita or gross. So that's what that's talking about. It's an ecological issue. It's really an issue about ecology. But anyway, that's a good reason. So in the next section, we're going to talk about why major new ideas are needed. So general federalism has the approach of, the old ideas. To a general federalist, the old ideas obviously didn't work. They don't work. They haven't worked. We've been spinning our wheels for over 1,000 years with nothing but old ideas rehashed and repackaged. And general federalism argues that clearly new ideas are needed, and especially if you're talking about global rule of law, because of the inherent challenge that presents. So no one's ever done that before. No one's ever tried to put together a way to manage society at a global central level before, and there are a lot of challenges there. So here are all the arguments, all the reasons why general federalists would say major new ideas are needed. Bottom-up sort of reevaluation of everything we know about the social contract. So the first reason is unambiguous empirical data shows that everything tried has failed. Quote, democracy doesn't work at the national level, much less at the global level. To be clear, neoliberal Western democracies always fail, and history has proven this. This does not mean, however, that representative government is a failed option. It is the particular neoliberal construction that is the problem, and we will explain that shortly. Another reason why we need new ideas. And this is related to that first point. Past performance is the best indicator of future performance. When it comes to durability, the West's much lauded neoliberal Western democracy is an abject failure. If we were to track all democracies, quote democracies, that appeared on the global scene since 1960, we'd find the following characteristics. Of about 120 attempts at democratization, half failed by 2010. This constitutes a 50% failure rate per 50-year duration. Given this half-life, essentially all would fail within 300 years. This is a disastrous durability figure that will not suffice for global governance. Keep in mind that the probability of any one democracy making it to the maximum duration of 300 years is exceedingly small. Based on these figures, ceteris paribus, it is more likely than not that a world government formulated as a democracy would fail within 50 years. There are two major problems with this. First, it is obviously too short a duration. Second, a global government cannot fail. For to do so would truly be disastrous, to an extent not equaled at a national level. The successful global government would have to be considerably more sophisticated in this regard. And that's true with almost every aspect of it. Anytime you're talking about a global rule of law, all of the difficulties at the national level are just amplified. They're just that much more challenging, and that much more confidence in the system that you come up with is needed. Those that fail tend to experience rapid economic growth up to their devolution, and overall economic hardship does not appear to be a factor. Normally, in a free market economy, rapid advances in wealth lead to rapid increases in the accretion of power, not just in government, but in society generally. And if that economic advance is too fast, the accretion is exaggerated, because the natural process of wealth disaggregating slightly after such an advance does not have time to act. In other words, the ratio of the aggregation of economic power to the disaggregation of economic power, call it rho, increases abruptly. Having said that, income inequality is correlated with the probability of state failure. This would be expected for high values of rho. Accretion of economic power along ethnic lines is correlated with a higher probability of state failure. This also makes sense since ethnic tension would only exacerbate the power accretion. Economic reforms, like trade liberalization and privatization, within the jurisdiction are negatively correlated with the probability of state failure. This follows naturally from the above, since reforms serve to suppress rho. There does not appear to be a correlation between the strength of a state's executive authority and the probability of state failure. As far as my own research is concerned, this is the only structural artifact for which data exists. Unfortunately, without complementary structural data, we can't infer much from this. And finally, what is perhaps the most damning finding for democracy is the fact that the degree to which a government is dysfunctional and unable to effectively provide its services is correlated with the probability of state failure. In other words, quote democracy simply collapses in on itself. Whether by corruption, inefficiency, fraud, or whatever else, democracies are prone to fail to fulfill their raison d'etre, or however you pronounce it, the reason of state, reason for existing. The economic realities of rho and the correlations above suggest that surges in the accretion of power lead to state failure in, quote, democracies. But this is exactly what any detractor of democracy would expect. The greatest weakness of democracy, according to detractors through history, has been its vulnerability to sudden increases in power accretion within a society. Stare decisis, I'm not sure how you pronounce that either, but that means on the face of it, or given the most obvious conclusion or observation based on a first glance. So stare decisis, this belies a foundational weakness of democracies, wherein they are especially vulnerable to usurpation, not solely from within the government, but from outside. That is, democracy is an abject failure because, in its more common form at least, it is a breeding ground of the popular faction Madison and Hamilton warned us about. And this isn't rocket science. Having said that, the purists could argue that general federalism does in fact admit of representation in the exercise of legal and economic power because of the ease with which the constituency can revoke those powers, even by force if necessary. Those that exercise power are influenced or threatened by the constituency through the attribute of deterministic annulment. That's what the term used is. So it's saying that general federalism is in the same vein of democracy, but it's a different kind, and that's what we were alluding to earlier, is that it's the particular formulation of neoliberal Western democracy that's the problem. It isn't necessarily the overall concept of representative government, and we'll definitely get more into that as we go. In summary, it is clear that neoliberal Western democracy is not an option for durable, just global governance. But perhaps more worrisome for the call to global governance is how to disabuse Westerners of this public myth about democracy and the rule of law, quote, rule of law, that they virtually worship like a god who doesn't exist. Westerners possess neither democracy nor rule of law, precisely because it doesn't work under the institutions they've created. And this is a very good reason for radically new ideas. We'll get a lot more into that, and we'll see what that's all about. A good way to start this conversation might be to ask, which do you value most? The ability to directly participate in governance, or that the government that governs is, in your opinion and experience, just? And do you prefer to participate in your wife's life or death surgery, or would you rather let a qualified doctor do that instead? As you can see, the answer should be obvious. The public mythos of direct participation in the execution of governing needs to be debunked publicly. So general federalism is not, what a lot of people think when we start talking about democracy and its problems and everything. It's not going in the direction of direct democracy. It's an entirely different direction than anything that I've ever heard of. It's not, so I can't really say it's going in the opposite direction, or describe it really. You just have to describe it in this video series, because there's just nothing really to compare it to. But it's not going in the direction of direct democracy, and we'll talk a lot more about that and about why such a seemingly obviously good idea, such as direct democracy, actually is counterproductive. It produces the very problems it's trying to solve. It basically takes the representative democracy, indirect democracy of the United States, for example, and just compounds those problems it already has. So we'll get into that. Another reason why we need new ideas. At this point, our discussion begs the question, why then do these democracies fail so easily? So we're getting into that. If you've ever watched a movie where a guy is sitting in a remote log cabin in the middle of the night by a candlelight and reading a horror story to some college girls, never realizing until it's too late that the horror story he is reading is in fact about them, then you will very much appreciate how living in an age dominated by a particular belief paradigm can blind you to the obvious. We live in the mythical age of the Western neoliberal democracy. So prepare to open your mind. Consider the following thought experiment. Imagine you live in a country in which the government is designed so that all the citizens can participate in government, in the execution of government, directly. This means that this government is the epitome of a democratic design, for it provides that the citizens can have a direct hand in either influencing or authoring public policy. The United States might be considered a fair approximation of this model, for here anyone is free to participate in the process of policy making, at least by influencing their congresspersons and president through letter writing, public protests, media outlets, and special interests, if they can afford the latter. But that is really the point, right? Is it not a little obvious that any government that has such a broadly open door policy to public influence will almost certainly be influenced by a minority who drown out everyone else? For who is to truly get the undivided attention of the president? You? Me? Sure, in some small way you can make your opinion felt, but the effect of your individual effort will pale in comparison to that of the privileged few who can sit on a couch with the president in the Oval Office. There are some 300 million people in the United States. Obviously, it is impossible for there to be any equity and participation in public policy decisions. The point here is that it should be blatantly obvious that the degrees of influence throughout the citizen population are dramatically, even precipitously out of proportion. And that in turn means that the very act of opening its doors, quote, to public influence in the creation of public policy does nothing to empower a tiny minority of elites within the citizen population. The oligarchy is a good example. This is so obvious it is painful to hear someone try to prevaricate their way out of this rabbit hole. Western neoliberal democracy is a scam, authored by an oligarchy, arguably, and foisted on a public lusting to hear someone proclaim their individual vast import and impact on the course of history. But if we take a step back and try to engage this question more objectively, we see that the problem isn't with representative government in and of itself. The problem is with how we define and understand, quote, democracy. In other words, simply opening the door to, quote, public, in the day-to-day business of government is like demanding that you be allowed to instruct and direct the surgeon performing surgery on your wife. It might make you feel important if someone tells you that you can do that. But the reality is that to do so is specious. And to allow every citizen of the country to do it is batshit insane. So carrying that analogy, what has happened in the Western neoliberal democracy scam is that you are told you can participate in the surgery, and the doctor will nod his head and seem quite cooperative. But it is the oligarch standing behind you that he is actually listening to and from whom he takes his instruction. There is a much better way to construct a representative government that abides the ideals of democracy, but avoids the fraud of the neoliberal flavor. We will examine that shortly, but simply note here that in a genuine, legitimate representative society, the public delegates and revokes political power, but they do not exercise it. Just like we do with our doctor. Though some may object that the, quote, influence a citizen has on the actual creation of public policy is quite limited, that argument only serves to bolster the contention that the limited impact is the direct result of the massive impact disproportionately given to the faction of oligarchy. So the only reason you don't have any influence in Washington is because you've been drowned out, basically is what that's saying. What is important to establish here is that in Western neoliberal tradition of the Western neoliberal tradition of democracy, the opportunity for anyone to influence public policy directly is present. And that's the key. And just real quick, you hear that phrase, neoliberal democracy. Don't kid yourself. It's a little misleading. It doesn't mean liberal in the sense that most people today think of liberal. Actually, it's very laissez-faire and very capitalist and typically very conservative, actually. So just so you know, that's actually not being used in the same way here. You can certainly believe that the lobbyists for General Motors, for example, reach rather deeply in the weeds on exactly what provision ends up in what bill and exactly how it is worded. So the key takeaway from this is to understand that what concerns us as General Federalists is not the fact that every single person can't participate equally, but that rather, when a government is set up as it is here in the United States, it rather forcefully empowers and accelerates the interest of the oligarchy by handing them a direct connection to the highest levels of political power, regardless of the negative impact that has on those who do not have as strong a voice, and the negative consequences it can and always does have for the nation as a whole. So the only thing such an open-door policy does is to act as a gigantic magnet that draws the most unscrupulous, corrupt, selfish, fascist personalities through it. If you can connect the dots, you will see once we discuss evisceration of rule of law in the United States that the former is causing the latter. And despite the overwhelming data, apologists for neoliberal democracy continue to make old and valid arguments to support the durability and representative quality of their system. One of many common arguments has been the so-called, quote, miracle of aggregation, unquote, which states that the law of averages will solve one of the key objections to democracy. That objection, voiced all too well by Winston Churchill when he said, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter, is that despite the average voter's lack of specialization and expertise in the subject matter of governance, is not an issue in neoliberal democracies because of the law of averages. He basically states that assuming a given population has a majority of constituents who are ill-informed or otherwise unqualified to make decisions about public policy, half of them will come up with the right answers, and the other half will not. Therefore, the law of averages suggests that all their votes will cancel each other. The remaining votes from informed and competent voters will then decide the election. But the assumptions of this theory are invalid. It assumes that the number of people arriving at the wrong answer will be equal to the number of persons arriving at the correct answer, even though the empirical data makes explicitly demonstrating this to be a fallacy. Excuse me, wait a minute. Let me back up. Even though the empirical data makes explicitly demonstrating this to be a fallacy, I see what he's trying to say. So the empirical data shows that we don't even have to really make this argument. We don't even have to establish this. But in any case, we can. Academics have, in fact, rigorously studied this question. And they've all found that it is, as the empirical data already discussed would suggest, that it is indeed fallacious, and that both hypothetical halves of uninformed constituency will not be proportionate. One researcher and economist, Brian Kaplan, PhD, wrote a book on the overall fallacy of democracy and has studied this matter empirically. He found that indeed the halves in this hypothetical will never be proportionate. Another built-in fallacy in its defense is the assumption, related to Kaplan's conclusion, that voters in a society such as this can't be unduly influenced by public relations. The politically correct term coined by Edward Bernays is a substitute for the more unacceptable term propaganda. This provides at least an explanation for why these hypothetical halves can be disproportionate, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if that is the reason, only that we know this defense is fallacious generally. And of course, even if we choose some other fraction instead of a half, we still find the same logic. Thus, suppose the choice is not binary, but there are, say, n possible choices. Then the same research shows that we will never see an equal proportion of all nth choices. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that if a medical doctor has no specialized, formal training in medicine, his or her decisions will likely be bad ones. And we wouldn't want him or her performing surgery on us. It isn't that the doctor is simple or personally deficient in any way. It's merely that he or she is ill-prepared, not the right person for that job, and he or she is being asked to do something wherein he or she is set up to fail. When we take this out of the ideologically tainted and stacked subject of politics, we can easily see, we can easily see this fact with little or no disagreement or doubt on the matter. So when you look at it objectively, you take a political scenario where someone's trying to, run the government and create public policy, and compare that to any other profession. We don't have any problem understanding this in any other profession. It's only in politics for some reason that people often don't want to accept that argument. They're resistant to that argument, but there's really no material difference. It's the same thing. It's just specialization of labor is all it is. So anyway, so when placed in an emotionally charged, heavily compromised and opinionated field, this common sense and obvious conclusion is pushed aside by appeals to authority, confirmation bias, the conjunction fallacy, and other well-known and studied phenomenon. We'll talk about those in a minute. That, too, has been shown to be an issue in ideological opinion. So we know it's a factor. We'll explore this in more detail later. Another reason why new ideas are needed. And we can't just use already existing old ideas and repackage them. This same, quote, open door policy that has allowed excessive influence of faction has led to the passage of laws in modern times as a matter of course that provide for an excessive and overly broad range of punishment to be applied in for their violation. On the one extreme, the punishment is draconian and severe, and on the other, it is more measured and reasonable. This is because faction has lobbied for these draconian, extreme, and reactionary laws, which, if actually enforced at that extreme, would be destabilizing due to their impact on the population. If enforced at such extremes, population revolts and mass loss of elections of politicians would almost certainly ensue, given the severity of these maximum allowed punishments. Therefore, the laws are written to allow the courts to impose punishments at the other, much more moderate extreme. And this more moderate punishment is the usual punishment the courts apply. In this way, faction is satisfied and gets the extreme and severe punishment they desire, at least on paper, while politicians are able to pass laws that don't, by their severe and draconian enforcement, cause them to lose elections in the future. The result of this is a body of statute full of laws that result in a highly unpredictable exercise of power. Let me read that again. We're going to start getting into this whole rule of law thing and what the problem really is. And that's one of the key problems. The result of this is a body of statute full of laws that result in a highly unpredictable exercise of power. This is directly counter to the definition of rule of law we mentioned previously. That was in part 1 when we defined how we're going to use that term. By definition, the system is operating well outside rule of law, and that is due entirely to the corrosive influence of faction. Very typical examples of this wildly varying range of punishments include the range of punishment provided for what in most states in the United States is referred to as driving under the influence of drugs. One very vocal and publicly visible faction in this debate were the family members of people killed in vehicular accidents involving alcohol. The issue of driving while intoxicated has been a subject of intense lobbying by faction, special interest. not just for the obvious safety issues involved, but for all sorts of varied, unjustifiable reasons, and has led to laws in some states that allow punishments for first-time offenders that can range from only 24 hours incarceration, it's 24 hours, all the way to 2 years of incarceration. The exact punishment determined only by the court. Adding to the unpredictability of the outcome is the fact that the manner in which intoxication can be defined is blurred and rendered ambiguous by the overly broad definition that is given. A person under the, quote, influence of prescription medication, not contraindicated for driving and taken at the prescribed doses could, if the court chooses to interpret it as such, be considered a drug of illegal, quote, influence. This sloppy broadening of definitions of terms has been applied with ubiquity throughout statutes, both in state and federal code. The examples are too numerous to list here, but the Patriot Act, for example, has led to definitions of the term terrorism that are so broad as to no longer have any meaning. And indeed, the provisions of the Patriot Act, quite predictably, are now being used in cases that manifestly have nothing at all to do with anything that could be construed as terrorism, such as run-of-the-mill prostitution and vagrancy, in which law enforcement admits has nothing to do with terrorism. So there have been cases like this where they've been used for what would be, by comparison, pedestrian crimes, and law enforcement acknowledges that. They admit that. It has nothing to do with it. And the reason why this is so important, going back to that definition of rule of law, is that the main theme when rule of law is defined, the people may define it slightly differently, but the one thematic thing that always comes through is that rule of law means that outcomes for violation of law have some degree of predictability. They're reasonably reasonably predictable. And when the definitions used in the law become too broad, and when the punishment range or range of punishments becomes too broad, that is the most common way in which unpredictability is introduced into a legal system. And so this is a direct impact on rule of law in the United States, and it's clear and obvious, but we'll go on. There's a lot more. Like the driving under the influence law, this means that the application of state power is grossly unpredictable. And an offender, even if in reality completely innocent of the crime the law appears to be drafted to address, has no idea what punishment to expect. And we should point out that the definition of rule of law as being a standard in which power is applied in a predictable pattern implicitly requires, if it is to make any sense at all, that this predictable pattern be clearly discernible, not just to professional attorneys, but to virtually any reasonable layperson. And this consequent unpredictability of intoxication laws is especially true in small provincial courts, where an offender might be an unpopular figure, such as an atheist, homosexual, or other rejected minority, who cannot be sure how extreme a judge is going to rule in their particular case. While it may seem remarkable that judges would be swayed by this, example after example shows that this is indeed the case, and anyone in any kind of minority or unpopular category will be faced with a particularly unpredictable, possibly draconian outcome. And I can tell you, if you have, anyone in the legal profession, if you can get a moment of honesty with them, will confirm this. This is well known in that profession. That people do that. Judges are 99% of their decisions are based on their own personal gut opinions. Since they are a minority, any outcry of the public for excessive and draconian punishment will not likely materialize. They will simply be quietly sent to jail and forgotten. So these laws can be both applied in an excessively broad manner, and the punishments exacted for them can be excessively broad. And when we note the pattern evidence here, which we shall see in so many examples of how laws of this nature produce this two-headed hydra called moral hazards, in this case for judges, who can be enabled and empowered to apply process to one individual in a manner completely inconsistent with the process normally considered due in any similarly situated individual. Though the highest court in the United States, the Supreme Court, has repeatedly and clearly ruled in case law for decades that all persons are entitled to the same legal process anyone else so similarly situated is due. This ruling is routinely ignored in the enforcement of these insanely broad laws, consisting of equally insane, broad definitions of terms. Indeed, even U.S. officials are beginning to misrepresent the meaning of this long history of case law by suggesting that due process is not the same thing as judicial process, implying that even those that do not receive any kind of judicial process may still be afforded a due process if it involves, for example, the buzz phrase national security. Of course, this is blatantly false, as case law clearly states that all persons are entitled to due process any similarly situated individual would normally receive. So what they're doing is they're dumbing it down. They're basically chopping off the rest of that sentence because the popular phraseology is just due process. So most people don't realize there's more to that sentence. So it's not just due process, and they've cleverly just kind of dropped off that part that most people don't know about anyway. By simply leaving off the last part of the more well-known condensed form of the Supreme Court's language of the, quote, due process phrase, these officials, such as Eric Holder, a U.S. Attorney General, can make these outlandish statements sound reasonable to a lay public. This explanation was used by Holder and others to justify the killing of U.S. citizens by the United States government, without any form of judicial process whatsoever. Something, by the way, also demonstrating the wildly extreme and broad range of punishments provided for anyone merely involved in the equally overly broad offense of, quote, terrorism. It is clear from this pattern of grossly unpredictable statute, in and of itself, that rule of law in the United States cannot possibly, by definition, exist. General Federalists suggest that this almost certainly will be viewed by future observers as criminal behavior, especially and with no undue embellishment, amounting to crimes against humanity. The point being made here is that whether you agree with the law or not is not the point. And whether you think that, even if you thought the law was too strict or whatever, politically, if you didn't agree with the law, it doesn't matter. The point being made here is the lack of predictability, that the terms are not defined. They're simply not defined, and that's deliberate. And the punishment range is too broad to be meaningful. So they've basically just removed meaning from the very things that make up the essence of law. In other words, they've removed the law. They've removed rule of law. That's what that does when you do that. And again, anyone in that profession who's worked in law will tell you, yes, that is what law is. If you take that out, it's gone. There is no rule of law. So that's what this is talking about. You could have, you might agree with the Patriot Act, but if a form that a general federalist would be, happy with would be one in which, the terms are defined. Terrorism has a very specific definition that they stick to, and the punishments are fairly narrow. You do this, and you know what's going to happen. It's predictable. So, thus, a new idea is needed, and another more creative way to ensure public participation and representation is obviously required, and simply repackaging the same problem, uncured and untreated, of Western neoliberal democracy cannot work, especially at a global level. And to be clear, the origin of this problem, like so many other violations of rule of law, and if studied closely by someone familiar with the legal profession, can be clearly traced to the corrosive influence of faction, the open-door policy of allowing direct participation in the creation of public policy. Persons familiar with the profession know for a fact, not by theory or ideological belief, but by fact born of direct experience and witnessing it, that this break in rule of law comes directly from the corrosive influence of faction. So the fifth reason why new ideas probably will be needed. In Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, 558 U.S. 310, 2010, that'd be the Supreme Court. The crescendo of Ravel's Bolero reached its apogee when the justices decided that corporations could donate to political campaigns just like natural persons, meaning they could do so anonymously. This means that an unknown entity could come into a congressional district from the other side of the country and destroy a candidate in the media who was in fact quite popular there. Why in the world would the justices do this? Which amounted to allowing corporations to control elections completely. Because they have been corrupted by moral hazards. In the movie Patriocracy, a U.S. congressperson stated that they have to plead so thoroughly to special interests that by the time they get to Washington, they have absolutely no discretion. Their stance on public policy has already been set in stone by the commitments they had to make in order to A, get the campaign financing they needed, and B, not invoke the wrath of special interest anti-campaign spending if they betrayed their masters and actually did what their constituents wanted them to do. But this sentiment has been echoed many, many times before by politicians. It couldn't be any clearer that the American experiment has failed, since it is blatantly impossible for any true representative governance to occur. If politicians are entirely beholden to special interests, which are by definition a factional opinion, then they cannot represent their constituents. This is a cold, hard fact. And the irony of the situation is that the very claim that an open-door policy to allow public input into governance is somehow, quote, democratic, is precisely what has made it not only undemocratic, but not even representative. So the irony there is that in an attempt to make a government more representative, more democratic, the more you go toward direct democracy, the worse you make it. It's counterintuitive, but you end up undermining the very ideals of democracy the more you go that way. Because, and as we're going to see more and more of this, because of the fact that the more powerful elements of society hijack your channel. In other words, your pipeline, your connection, your contact with the policy itself. You know, even if it's a direct democracy, your ability to put your hands on it and create the public policy, history tells us, will almost certainly be bullied away from you. If there's not a system there to stop that and block that bullying, it will happen, and that's why it doesn't work. And we'll see a whole lot more of that and a whole lot more justification for that argument as we go through this. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, but I think it's pretty compelling. So the American experiment is riddled with this dichotomy, and it is screaming of what general federalism says about the difference between executing the social contract versus delegating and revoking the political power to execute the social contract. There are now over 200 years of experience in the American experiment to make this point crystal clear. The saddest part of patriocracy was watching what we've seen in this country for decades. People complain about the dysfunction of the American system, but never once are the obvious and pervasive structural problems hinted at, much less discussed. The same Band-Aid solutions discussed in 1960 are repackaged and repeated in 2013. And over an hour of drivel about how to, quote, fix a system with solutions repeated since 1950, really, that isn't just broken, but mal-designed and structurally unsound, patriocracy never once mentions the deeper structural issues involved. They've been talking about fiscal irresponsibility for decades. They've been talking about Congress's inability to, quote, get along for decades. They've been talking about special interest faction for decades. They've been talking about Social Security for decades. They've been talking about the illegal, for example, clandestine activity of the CIA for decades. In fact, this discussion about special interest or faction has been going on since James Madison and Alexander Hamilton started talking about it. They talked about it a lot, and that subject has never ended, and there's never been a solution. It has never been solved. It's only gotten worse. Nothing has changed. It's insanity. It's structural. So I think we'll stop here for part 2, and we'll go to part 3 next to finish this section. I think we're about halfway through this section, and we should be able to get to section 3. Let me just see how much farther we have here. Yeah, it looks like we'll be able to get through this in the next section. So, well, maybe not. I don't know. It's kind of long. But if we do, the next section coming up would be the legal character of general federalism. So maybe two more parts before we get there. So anyway, that's it for this for part 2, and we'll be back with the rest of it. And we'll see you then.